So whenever Ryan was first introducing this topic at the beginning of the summer, and he was mentioning some of the miracles, he pointed out one of them and said, man, if I were teaching a class, this would be the one I'd want to do. And then I got very nervous because he chose my class. So hopefully I can live up to that. But even though I've prepared a decent amount of stuff, I value what you all say much more than what I prepared. So please interrupt me if I don't see your hand. Make comments at any time. I like it a lot more whenever it's a discussion and a lot less of me talking, because I don't think I have any wisdom or anything really exciting or new to say. I much rather value everyone else's perspectives. So this evening, I'm going to be talking about the miracle of healing the blind. I'm going to kind of base it around spiritual blindness and how that applies to us. But first, I want to talk more about the physical blindness. And I'm going to start with the idea of God's promise to the blind in the Old Testament. So if we look on the screen in Psalm 146 and verse 8, the Lord opens the eyes of the blind. In Isaiah 35, and this was a verse actually I read last week for Jay, one of the things that is mentioned is, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened. And then lastly, in Isaiah 42, verses 6 through 7, I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. So we can see that in this list of many different difficulties that people faced, blindness is one of those that is frequently mentioned inside, and is pointing to the fact that God is trying to show his people this promise that will happen in the miracles that Jesus provides. I also want to give just a little bit of context of how people at the time of this miracle would have viewed blindness in the law, in those three verses, and we won't read them for the sake of time. It mentions that blind animals were not to be sacrificed, it was forbidden, and blindness altogether symbolized imperfection. And so someone who was blind at that time would not have been viewed in the same light as someone who was able to see. And really, I asked myself, what's the point of that? Why would I even spend the first couple of minutes introducing that? Blindness in the Old Testament was seen as a disqualification, but the promises of God bring restoration and hope. And I think there's a lot of power in the fact that Jesus intentionally goes out of his way to find people who are blind and to heal them and show his miracles through that. Does anyone have any comments? Awesome. I really just wanted to set that up because it is a lot of what we're going to see and how people should have viewed them at the time. There's also the idea of blindness being foretold in two different ways. Can I have a reader read Luke chapter 4, verses 17 through 19? Luke 4, starting in verse 17. So this is something that would have been on the mind and the heart of Jesus as he's going around providing these miracles and healing these people who are blind. He later goes on to say that the scripture has been fulfilled through him. But we also see there's an opposite kind of blindness that is foretold. In Isaiah 6 and verses 9 and 10, it says, "Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed." We can see in this context, it may not actually be talking about people physically not being able to see, but the main focus of my class this evening, which is going to be spiritual blindness and not seeing what God is doing for his people. Blindness as a miracle is one of those that is seen in all four Gospels. And this may not be a complete list. I went through each of the four Gospels, and every time that I saw someone who is being healed who is blind, I wrote it down. But I am just one guy, and Google is not always a reliable source to back that up. But you can see that we can find Jesus healing blind people in all 4 Gospels. And to me, that tells me that this is an important thing and not something that is just like a run-of-the-mill discussion, but that there is something deeper provided with all these people being healed. So we can see in Matthew 9, Jesus heals 2 blind men. In Matthew 12, the demon-oppressed man was blind that Jesus heals. And then in Matthew chapter 20, one of the focuses we're going to look at the Mark verse. Jesus heals 2 blind men on the way to Jericho. One of them we learned is named Bartimaeus in the Mark's account. And then there's a little star next to the Luke because it looks like it's the same story, but I kept seeing online some people like, well, it could be the same story, but it could be a different person, and so I'm just covering my tracks in case someone feels passionately that it is not or it is. And Mark 8, which is another one, and the first one we're going to look at, if you want to start turning there, Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida, and I think I say that wrong every time I say it. And John chapter 9, which is something that Jay mentioned in his class last week, Jesus heals a man born blind and then has him wash in the pool of Siloam. Tyler and Riley did that for the kids down at VBS this year, and that was quite the sight to see. And then lastly, in Matthew 15 and in 21, there's an unnamed multitude of blind people who are healed. When they are listing off some of the things that Jesus did, people who were blind was included in that list. And so I think overall, this is a very important miracle, and I don't want to diminish the fact that physically healing someone who cannot see and allowing them to see is an incredible thing. But I think that in the verses we're going to look at, there is a much deeper connotation and spiritual application for us beyond the fact that someone who was blind can now see. And that's what we're going to really spend a good chunk of our class talking about. This was just kind of me wanting to introduce the topic. Does anyone have anything they want to say? Anything they think I overlooked or maybe glossed over a little too quickly?
I just think it's the Isaiah 9, I think, the passage you showed. It's like the key to Isaiah 6, verses 9 to 10. It's like the key to understanding what we're talking about. I mean, I think that's the blindness really that he's really trying to overcome so we can see these things spiritually, as you put it. And then we have a song, Amazing Grace, I once was blind, but now I see, kind of gives that same idea. The purpose of all this blindness being healed is really the spiritual blindness that is what's most important.
Yeah, and how we are actually seeing. Yes, I agree. We're going to start in Mark chapter 8, if you have not already turned there. I'm going to turn there myself so I can follow along. Can I have someone read Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26? But before you get started, I put 2 questions up on the screen. Don't feel like you actually have to answer them, but these are the 2 things that I was thinking about as I was reading through this miracle and the verses that we'll read connecting to it that kind of helped guide my thinking. And so just something to put a little pin in your head while you're thinking about it, or whatever the expression is. Mark 8, verses 22 through 26.
When they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he said, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village."
So something that I have overlooked almost every time I've read this passage is the fact that it wasn't just the blind man was there and Jesus saw him, but it was people brought the blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. And I think, not to jump ahead of myself into application later on, something to keep in mind for ourselves, especially in our walk with Christ and with those around us, is we can help others who are blind to be able to see. And sometimes that is the most impactful thing that we can do. And I think that their credit, they're not named, none of the people in this story are, other than Jesus, shows that they are still caring for those around them and wanting them to see as well. And I think that's powerful. But we can see physically in this story The man is blind, and then Jesus heals him. And when he asks if he can see, he says, I can see, but the people look like trees walking. So he can see, but he can't completely see. And then Jesus lays his hands on him again, and his sight is restored, and he can see everything clearly. And this little progression of being able to see better and better over time is going to be then seen through the parallel with Peter. So if we continue on in Mark chapter 8 and getting into verse 9, we'll see 3 different stories involving Peter and his blindness. And so as we go throughout these next couple of sections, I want to focus on this man and this example that we see with him and how it connects to Peter's walk and Peter's blindness in the situations. Can I get a reader for Mark 8, 27 through 30?
Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
So we can see here, Peter sees Jesus. He confesses he is the Christ. But if we then go to the very next verse, I'll read starting in 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter just saw Jesus. He just confessed he was the Christ. But then he followed it up by not seeing Jesus as the Christ. And then going down into, can I have someone read chapter 9, verses 2 through 8?
And he said to them, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, led them up a high mountain by themselves. He was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. They appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. But Peter says to Jesus, "Rabbi, is it good that we are here? Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only.
Before I say what I want to say, does anyone want to take the first comment?
This kind of point you're making, but I'd always read this story about the blindness, and I never put it together that it had anything to do with the rest of the story. I thought it was kind of just thrown in there, and I didn't really get why. And then I thought it was very odd though, because to my knowledge, off the top of my head, most of the miracles, when Jesus was healing someone, it would just happen. Like it wasn't like a halfway thing. So I mean, it seems like very specifically, it's explaining the progression with the blindness of Peter. I know that's what you were saying, but
No, I think preparing for this study, I totally nerded out on all of it because I was like, how did I not see this before? Like, this is incredible. But it is just so amazing that it is a direct parallel with that.
In this passage that you just read in chapter 9, there, towards the end of it, it says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." There was a voice came out of the cloud. So you're talking about blindness, but here we are being told to listen, which is not the same as see. But it's like, listen, this is more important what you're going to see. And then
Yeah, I think for me, I was having so much struggle with the phrasing to explain my thinking. I've got it all up in my head of them seeing is the seeing to understand, combating with the seeing to actually see. And so the listening is definitely a part of the understanding connected with it, but it is something that I think it just completely solidifies. Not only can he now see Jesus, but now he heard God to confirm what he is seeing.
I think it's so neat in verse 23 in chapter 8, and it says, so he took the blind man by the hand. And that's us, and it's like Jesus is showing such a compassion, and when we try to be like Jesus and show compassion for the world, we can forget the next part of the story, and it's he had a partial understanding, like we all had a partial understanding and still have partial understanding. And so it's like you want to fast forward people's walk, and sometimes we forget that they can see, and then they can see, and it's like the Lord has had the same patience with me, and I should extend the same grace and love for them. You know, he reached out his hand and led him. And it's just a beautiful picture of Jesus.
Yeah, I think it was very encouraging for me in the thought of there are places that I am still spiritually blind and may not be able to fully see, but it's something that I can have hope in that will come over time if I just stick with Jesus and be able to see. Jay, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, a few just different observations. One of the things that I liked, and this, you haven't gotten to all of them, but one of the things that I like that Jesus does, the way he heals the blind, it isn't some ritual that he goes through every time. There's different ways
Yeah.
that he does it each time. So I find that particularly interesting. So there's not something like that can be mimicked directly, like, oh, here's what Jesus did, I can do it. It shows I'm going to do things however I want. I am the Son of God. I've got the power to do it. I can spit on you and do it. I can make mud and do it. I can make you go wash and do it. I can just say you're healed.
Yeah.
I can say somebody is healed 50 miles away from here. So there's this kind of thing that I like about that in particular. I also like when you're talking about Peter, but think of how quickly this man went from partially seeing like Peter to immediately seeing, based on the two steps that Jesus did, spitting in the eyes and then putting his hands in his eyes. So there's something about that, and then actually obeying him when he says, "Don't go." Think of how many times people don't run and do exactly what he says not to do.
Don't tell anyone.
He actually really did see Jesus and really did follow and immediately obeyed.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, yeah, and we'll talk about that if we can get to the 3 examples that I have. That is very true, that there are different ways that the people are healed in each of them, and that really fits what's going on around those stories and the spiritual blindness connected with it. That's I didn't really think about bringing that up, so thank you.
I just see Peter and myself. I was going to say us, but in myself, like Peter was well intentioned. Like Peter, but he thought it was a good thing. Both times he thought it was a good thing. It wasn't Jesus' way, it was his way. And so how many times do my intentions, while they may be good and for the Lord, are misplaced because I'm leaning on my own understanding, not Jesus' understanding, Lord's understanding. So,
That's a fantastic point. I think it can be nice sitting over here a couple thousand years later, be like, why didn't Peter get it? But then I think about my own life, and it's like, why can't Brennan get it? So it is something that we're all trying to focus on, seeing Jesus and seeing what God has for us instead of what I think is the best thing for myself because I can't see the whole picture.
I think, I feel like Jesus, he used the mud as part of like a way to heal, but obviously mud's not going to heal blindness. Otherwise, we would figure out a cure some way like that. But I think that like it's kind of cool that and also we being people that love, that need the visual and need the
Yeah, instead of focusing on the wrong thing, Jesus is going to say, I'm going to make sure you understand where this is coming from.
Kind of an interesting educational process. Kind of playing off of what each of you just said, but here you've got Peter, he thinks he's got it, but doesn't really have a deep connection to it. And how many times in our life could be secular thing that you're thinking, hey, I got this, and you go out and try it, and you fall flat on your face, and it takes a mentor to kind of pick you back up. No, this is how we do this, you know. And that seemingly is how God handled this. Peter tried, and you got that right, and then he completely missed, because he didn't have a deep connection with who Christ really was, and then he got shown, he got taken up on the mountain, he got to see for real what's going on. And so,
Yeah, there's like the encouragement built in for Peter as well as it is for us today of you'll be able to see over time. Does anyone else? Dave?
I was thinking about the part, verses 30, chapter 8, 32 and 33, where Jesus just said, I'm going to die. And Peter says, not on my watch, more or less. And how clearly Peter sees, and he does understand this point, that Jesus knows that he's going to die, and Peter understands that what he's saying is what he's saying. But even still, he doesn't see clearly. And God, Jesus here is patient with him, doesn't cast him out, continues to train him, continues to know what's coming in the future for him, and how it's flawed, and how he's still, Jesus, faithful to Peter, and awaiting for him to continue to grow.
Yeah, and that second part in verse 33, I can almost imagine Jesus just saying, you don't see it yet. And that like gives me chills. Awesome. We're going to go on to our next verse, and that is going to be in Mark 10. So in this example that we just looked at, the blind man was healed through the miracle, and then we have the connection with Peter after that. We're going to actually have the opposite happen. It's almost like bookends with the Mark 8 healing and the Mark 10 healing, to where we're going to see the disciples now are the ones who can't see. Yeah.
Oh, real fast before we go, I was just thinking about what Dave said and how Jesus is patient with him here when he doesn't understand. I mean, he does rebuke him pretty bad, but then he goes ahead and takes him up on the Mount of Transfiguration and lets him actually see who he is. So, like, I just think, like, God has everything for us, even in our blindness. It's here to tell us what he is and who he is. We just have to look at it.
That's a great point. We're going to start in chapter 9 and verse 33. So for the sake of time, I'm going to read these two examples. There's a couple others that we can get in there, but just showing where the disciples are versus where Jesus wants them to be. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, he being Jesus, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Jesus is like, you're thinking about the wrong things. You're focusing on what's not important. And we have another example of something very similar if you turn to chapter 10 and verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want for you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. And we'll stop there because I think a lot of us know the context of this verse. But again, it's Jesus saying, like, you just don't see what I'm here to do, and you don't see what you're here to do. And then, right after that situation, that conversation between Jesus and James and John is where we get to the second person who is healed in the book of Mark. Can I have a reader for Mark 10, verses 46 to 52?
When they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way.
Again, before I share, does anyone have something, first comment they want to make?
I was gonna say, I find it interesting that, in some ways this blind man saw better than the others, and he knew that Jesus was the son of David, the one that was coming, and he wasn't ashamed to voice that.
Yeah. Jesse?
I just think to your credit, the stories are tied together. Jesus responds the same way to both James and John and the blind man. What do you want me to do for you?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, that's not accidental.
It's amazing how it works like that. Josh?
Just think about the blind man seeing and how that would improve his quality of life to the point where he didn't care what anybody else thought. He was calling out to Jesus and calling out to Jesus. And then he found out that Jesus was calling him and essentially knew he was going to help him, and he sprang up. And we are the blind man, and we need Jesus, and he will improve our life and give us life everlasting. So we need to spring up too.
Yeah, I think if you compare the actions of the disciples, they're ashamed when Jesus confronts them on what they were talking about. And then James and John come to him privately because they don't want anyone else to hear, as opposed to Bartimaeus, who, even though people are rebuking him and telling him to be silent, he refuses to be silenced because he knows what he has in front and who he has in front of him.
I think there's also the lens that different people are looking at Christ through. A lot of people are looking for a physical ruler to come and overthrow Rome, to be the king on earth. But then other people, like Bartimaeus, understands that as a spiritual king. So he sees him in the correct lens, rather than James and John looking for a physical ruler to sit next to.
In addition to what Jessica said about knowing who Jesus was, his son of David, as a term of respect, I see almost in verse 51 where he says, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." There's like an emphatic. It's almost like a demanding prayer to me how he's saying that. Like I believe you will do this. I know you will do it.
Yeah. It's not, will you recover my sight? It's, let me recover my sight.
So I don't know if there's a point to be made here, if I'm just overstretching the metaphor, but it's interesting to me here in chapter 10, and I think also in chapter 8, the first blind man that we read about, that both of them appear to have had their sight before, and they are regaining. Here, he uses the word, "I want to regain my sight," which to me, I think we can look at the scriptures with this kind of scrutiny. I think that the words are chosen for us by the Holy Spirit. So he wanted to regain. It's something that he lost. And then back in the 8th chapter, when he could, just kind of barely see, he said, I see men, but they look like trees. Well, if you've been blind since birth, I'm not sure you would know to make the comparison to trees. Maybe you felt a tree, and it's pretty solid, but I don't know. It seems to me more likely that person knew what a tree looked like, and he saw a man, and they felt like they were trees. So if I am stretching the metaphor, then representative of man having lost their communication, their association, their ability to be with God, and man regaining through Jesus Christ, their ability to have commerce, have communication, have or be in God's presence. Let's just put it like that. This is the story of all of mankind regaining something through Christ.
And that connects back to the promises that we saw in the Old Testament of redemption and hope. Anyone else?
Just in the few verses that we've read, it's mentioned 3 times. Jesus tells them, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm going to die. And I think that's part of what Jesus is trying to get them to see. He's not going to be here, an earthly kingdom, like Peter and John wanting to be on his right and on his left, and, no. You gotta see this. I am going to die on the cross.
Yeah, it's again that question, just why can't you see what I'm actually doing? Why can't you see what I'm here to do? All right, we'll see how quickly. I've got one more example that I would love to get to. I won't be able to do it justice just for the sake of time, but we're going to go to John chapter 9. This was, we read the beginning of last week, and I think it's worth reading that again just because it is a different type of person who was blind. As Rob mentioned, this man is going to be, he was born blind as opposed to the 2 people who were lost their sight. And also we can get a better understanding of why people would be blind. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 9. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, It was not that this man sinned, or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. And he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, Go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Again, does anyone want to make the first comment before I say that? Prepared? Nick?
The I am statement here fits perfectly with this whole class. I am the light of the world. Because in a very literal sense, you can't see anything without light. Everything we see is a reflection of light entering our eyes. And so if you take that to mean Jesus is the light of the world, everything we see is because of Christ. Everything we have is seen through Christ in a way. So it's more than just being able to perceive the world, it's perceiving the world through Christ.
Yeah, that's a great point. He is who allows us to see. So I'll state the obvious for all of our sakes. It says here that the man was blind not because of his sin or his parents' sin, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. And I think in the first 2 examples we saw in Mark 8 and in Mark 10, we can see that the works of God were there as well, pointing to Jesus is the work of God on earth. And the people who were surrounding him, either Peter or the other disciples, were supposed to see that. If we can, for the sake of time, I prepared way too much, I apologize. We're to look through this story right here, we can see the progression of the man who was born blind. So if we start in 8 through 12, the neighbors are the ones who see him, and they're like, we recognize that guy. Isn't that the one who was born blind and who used to sit and beg? And some are like, yeah, it's him. And others are like, no, but it looks like him. And he keeps saying, I am that man. And they ask him, okay, well, what happened? And he says, the man called Jesus healed me, and goes through the story with them. And they're like, where is he? And he says, I don't know. And then they go to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees don't care that this man was blind. They are so much more focused on the fact that it was a Sabbath day when Jesus did this. It's like you are hearing about a man who was born blind and now can see, and your focus isn't on who did this, what can we do to get in contact with him so that we can learn more about him? It is, who did this so we can yell at him because he did it on a Sabbath? And at the end of that little section with him talking with the Pharisees, they ask, what do you say about him since he's opened your eyes? And the man born blind says, he is a prophet. While the Pharisees are focusing on persecuting Jesus, this man is able to recognize that he is from God. If we keep going through, then the Jews who could be connected with the Pharisees, I found some things that was just other religious leaders, ask his parents questions about it, and they say, ask him. He's of age. They were afraid to admit what they saw themselves for sake of persecution. And then at the very end of this section here, they ask him again, and they say, we know that this man is a sinner because he did this on the Sabbath. And the man who was born blind just keeps arguing, like, how could he have done this if he was a sinner? Like, he has to be from God. And we are going to read, starting in verse 35. Can I have someone read 35 through 41?
Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" He answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." Then he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." And some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, "Are we blind also?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin, but now you say, 'We see,' therefore your sin remains."
Does anyone want to make the first comment?
He was physically blind and can see, and now he was spiritually blind, but now he's able to see that Jesus is the Son of God.
Yeah. His story throughout these sections of like, well, his name was Jesus, to he's a prophet, to he must be from God, to I believe you are the Son of Man, is just such an incredible, again, like we talked about with the first story, progression of sight and being able to understand to eventually reaching that level of submission. And it started with him listening to what Jesus told him to do. And on the flip side, that beautiful juxtaposition that I love as an English teacher, you can see the Pharisees just, they think they know, and they think they know, and because of that, they can't see what is actually happening in front of us. And to me, that's terrifying, because it makes me worried of, what do I think I know that is preventing me from seeing the works of God?
Yeah, that's what stood out to me, is that you can be blind and profess God all over the place. It's whenever your attitude flips to God needs me, or God is lucky to have me, or I'm defined by these things, that then we can be blind in our fake self-sufficiency. And really this idea of the sight is like we see our need and we come so humbly, and that's what God is looking for. The blindness isn't always like what I would think of like an outright denial of God and rebellion.
Yeah. All right, for the sake of time, we're going to fast forward to, I'll read this actually. The context surrounding these passages emphasizes that although the actual healing of the blind is a wonderful thing and is a miracle, they serve a much greater purpose for those following Jesus or who were present for this miracle. It made those people see who were truly blind. And we'll fast forward. Does anyone have any takeaways? I prepared a few, but I want you all to share first, because again, just me.
The whole story is about Jesus. I mean, he is our provision. He is what will heal us, and he is what will save us. And we just have to end it like in verse 38 where it says, "Lord, I believe," and then fall to our feet and worship him. He is going to be the one fixing my sin problem.
Amen. Anyone else?
Well, in that last one we looked at too, he
So my first takeaway is a self-reflection question of where are the blind spots in my faith, praying for opening our eyes to seeing those spiritual blindness places that we have. If you saw on my cover, it's a really weird grainy picture, and I stole this from a sermon I heard, so don't give me credit. But I think it connects to the blindness of sometimes we can't see the bigger picture that's going on, and that could be what's causing our blindness. Second one is sight does not always come completely, immediately, but in stages, so don't lose hope, as we saw with the first example in Mark 8. Our response, and this is like what Becky was saying, to being able to see Jesus is to worship and to change. So the man who, blind Bartimaeus, followed Jesus afterwards. The blind man in John 9 worships Jesus. And then lastly, how can we help others see? You got like 2 minutes left.
I think there's a component as well that these people were asking for Jesus to give them their sight. And like you said, where are we not seeing? And it's the knock and ask and seek. And we have an obligation of ourselves to pursue it.
Yeah.
Not just sit back and say, it'll happen sometime.
Yeah. Don't wait until you can't see anymore. Anyone else? Morgan?
The fourth question really is relevant to me, like what I'm walking through with some friends right now, and sometimes it's so hard to be patient with people as they learn to see in stages, and this just gives me a lot of hope that it is a progression, and sometimes it's just not all there at one time, and to be patient and advocate for them, and be, begging God on their behalf, and to just not give up on those people. So it's a great reminder.
I agree. Anyone else? All right. Thank y'all. We can end a minute early. I don't think we'll be in trouble for that.